Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. This is a vault. It's made by a company called Protectli. It's a lovely little box. No moving parts whatsoever. You can see we've got a 2.5-inch SSD here. We've got some laptop SODIMM RAM here. And we also have a little mSATA SSD in here. Underneath it, there's a wireless interface as well that you can populate, although this one doesn't have that. Lovely little box. Completely passive cooling too. This entire thing is solid metal, and it feels it too. You're not going to dent this thing easily anyway. And with the heat fins across the top, it does do a very good job of keeping it cool. As you can tell, I like it a lot. We use some of these units, usually smaller ones, primarily as routers running OpenSense. This one, however, had a bit of a different story. Rewind for a minute back to 2022. COVID had completely disrupted everybody's supply chains, but we were starting to recover. At the time, we still had a pretty long lead time for things like servers. A new server ordered from Dell, for example, might not arrive for 5 to 6 weeks. And because of previous supply chain problems, costs, and the difficulty of deploying new equipment during lockdowns and restrictions in 2020 and 2021, quite a few of our customers had needed to delay some necessary hardware replacements. So, I had an idea. What if I took one of these little vaults, stuffed it with a fair amount of RAM and storage, and turned it into a miniature hypervisor? I mean, it wouldn't be fast, not at all, but it might be able to fill a gap if there was imminent or complete hardware failure. It could, if necessary, even run OpenSense as a virtual router, as well as a virtual server or two. It would become sort of a lifeboat for a business to use until they could get replacement hardware. The execution of this idea was interesting on a technical level. The vast majority of our work is in the Windows world. If we had to move a virtual server into this lifeboat, it would most likely come from a Windows environment. And certainly, if we had to convert a physical server to virtual, move it into the lifeboat, we would then be moving it out of the lifeboat back into a Windows environment. That means I wanted a host operating system that could run Hyper-V. For quite a few years, Microsoft actually had a completely free product called Hyper-V Server. If you're familiar with VMware, it filled the same niche as the free version of ESXi. Hyper-V Server, unfortunately, was discontinued after the 2019 version. I wish they had kept it. It would have been extraordinarily useful. The big catch to Hyper-V Server was that it had no GUI. When you logged in, you had a command prompt and maybe a text-based menu system for basic operations. That was it. There was no web interface, and any management would typically need to be performed from a different workstation running the management tools. Hyper-V Server 2019 also does not include the necessary drivers for the Vault's network cards. That's okay, because Intel makes drivers available. However, for whatever reason, Intel has coded the drivers so that they can be installed into Windows Server 2019, but not Hyper-V Server 2019. This was probably an oversight because they're fundamentally the same code base, but it means the drivers won't install, even though they would work. To fix this, I altered the driver file to allow installation into Hyper-V Server. Of course, when you do that, the signature on the drivers becomes invalid, which also prevents the drivers from being loaded. Normally, this is a good thing. You don't want to install a driver that has a fake or a bad signature. But in this case, I know who modified the driver: me! To get the driver to install now, I had to disable signature enforcement using some arcane command. Honestly, I don't remember what it was, and I'd have to look it up again if I wanted to use it in future. But once I got the driver to install, I was able to re-enable signature enforcement and simply use what was now already installed. And remember, all of this had to be done with no GUI, no point-and-click tools, no dialogues to navigate. Everything, all of this, is command line only. But clearly, it would be helpful to have at least a limited graphical interface. If not for myself, then certainly for others. Well, Microsoft has another free product called Windows Admin Center. Interestingly, you could install this on Hyper-V Server, and it provided its own web server so that you could log into it from a browser and use a set of web pages to manage the server as a whole. Of course, you wouldn't want to log into this using plain insecure HTTP, so you'd also need an SSL certificate. It's possible to generate a self-signed certificate, sure, but we can do better than that these days. So I also added the WinAcme client to manage certificate renewal. Windows Admin Center requires you to reinstall it to update the certificate. It's just the way it is. So I added another script to auto-download any newer version of Windows Admin Center and install that anytime the certificate renewed, which would be about every 2 months. So far, so good. But there was still the fact that you would need to use a workstation at the customer site to access Windows Admin Center. As the last piece, I added WireGuard to create a VPN back to our main office. Anytime the server was turned on, it would open a VPN connection back home. And so anybody at our office would be able to access and manage the server securely, no matter where it had been deployed. Was it a smooth operation putting all of this together? No, not at all. But would it work in an emergency? Yes, it would. And it did. We deployed this to a customer on Vancouver Island for a month and a half, while they were waiting for new equipment. When they received the new equipment, the virtual server moved off the lifeboat and onto new hardware, and the lifeboat came back to us, ready to be used again if needed, exactly as designed. The next customer who needed it was suffering from a server that was no longer reliable. And when your hardware is no longer reliable, you generally don't want to keep running on it. So as before, I deployed this little emergency box with a warning to the customer that it was intended for a month or two of use, maybe 3 months at the very most. This customer did not heed my warnings, and neither did my own company. The maximum lifetime for the unit came and went. The customer didn't want to order new equipment, or one of my coworkers would tell them that they didn't have to order new equipment. I warned the customer. I warned my coworkers. A full year came and went. Now, like I said, this was only designed for emergency use, and there were a lot of different pieces working together to create a functional system. Sometimes a glitch with the installation of Windows Admin Center would mean we couldn't access the GUI anymore. Sometimes a power outage at the customer's site would mean the unit would boot before the switch it was connected to was fully powered up, meaning the server didn't have an active network connection at boot, causing WireGuard to fail until somebody logged in to restart the service manually. If you were only running this as an emergency stopgap for a couple of months, these kinds of things wouldn't have an opportunity to happen too often, so they weren't a notable problem. But when you run like that for over a year, some of my coworkers became frustrated with the system. Somehow, without anybody telling me, it became accepted to simply unplug the server from power and then plug it back in again to fix whatever was wrong with it. And worse, the people who decided to take that shortcut told others to use that shortcut as well. Well, now it's dead. A combination of misuse and overuse, all of which I was warning people about for months and months The operating system on this unit is now so hopelessly corrupted, I would have to rebuild everything I did, starting from scratch. And I don't know yet if I even will, if it's going to be abused like that again. Why do I tell you this story about this little block of hardware? Well, if you ever have aspirations to be a sysadmin or a network admin, you will need creativity. The ability to dig around in your stores of knowledge, to find tools and bits of systems from here and there, to take all of that and assemble it into a functioning whole, that ability is very powerful. And honestly, it's also a lot of fun. But that's only part of the story. Could we create a new server for our customer by recycling old, unreliable equipment and slapping a new Windows installation on it? Yes, we could. And it would be a huge disservice to us and our customer if we did so. There's no warranty, and a brand new operating system will only be able to paper over problems with failing hardware for so long. Could we solve a spam problem by granting ourselves access to the CEO's email inbox, browsing through it, and removing any spam we find? Yes, we could, and we'd rightly be sued into oblivion for doing so. Could we create a brand new custom VPN solution that's different for every single customer? Yes, we could. And without a standard, it would become exponentially harder to support each customer and make sure everybody had a consistent experience. Creativity is necessary because it lets you come up with new ideas and new solutions that can be very useful. But it's not a replacement for doing necessary work, behaving ethically, or following defined standards. Creativity gave birth to this cool little server. But without those other attributes, cool ideas die. Putting all those traits to use and keeping them in balance is part of the job of a network admin. I hope that possibly contained some interesting information or useful insight for you. I am your next door net admin. Thanks for joining me.